YouTube! Okay, so today I'm doing something a little bit different. Specifically, I am doing a little tiny sewing tutorial. So what I've done is I drew this design, this little die, on the computer, and then I had it printed onto fabric through a site called Spoonflower. So now it's printed onto this really nice, soft, minky fabric. And what I'm going to do today is I'm sewing it to this plain backing fabric, and I'm going to turn it into a little tiny, like, hand-sized plushie. If you do want to do one of these on your own, I will leave a link in the description box below to where you can get the fabric. You can basically buy a yard of it, and it has this design and a whole rainbow of other dice designs, including a bunch that are bigger. And I'm also going to be taking some of these individual cutouts that I've done myself and turning them into little craft kits that I'm going to be hopefully selling at some of my local markets. So if you happen to be local to me, then you can also maybe check me out at a show and get a little individual craft kit like this. I'm starting here with what I'm going to be including in the kits. So a pre-cut backing. This is in a plain cotton twill fabric. It's just really simple, not too stretchy, plain white. And the pre-cut out piece here. But obviously, if you're buying the fabric online, you're just going to need to cut out around this yourself, and then trace a backing out of any other fabric you'd like. Yeah, so let's see about getting started. So first, whether you've got the kit or you've just picked up the fabric, there are a few other things you're going to need. First off, you're going to need some pins and needles. Nothing fancy, these are just basic pins and needles. You're going to need some thread. I've decided to go with this sort of teal light green thread, just because it's going to be a little easier than plain white to see on camera. It's also just going to be a little bit easier on my eyes to see where I'm sewing. If you want the stitching to not show up at all once this is done, using a white thread would be better, but as long as you keep your stitches small, using a light colored thread isn't going to be a huge deal, and you might find it easier. And then the last thing you're going to need is just going to be some polyester or cotton or whatever stuffing. And that's just going to be right for the end. Yeah, so let's get started. The first thing I'm going to need to do is pin these two pieces together. And I'm going to need to be pinning them good sides together, so I'm pinning it inside out. Now what I've done for these craft kit pieces, and what you might want to do for yourself if you're tracing out your own backings, is I've left a little notch that lines up with the corner that's by the D20 mark. That way it's really easy for me to see exactly which way this lines up, because if you see, if I turn it around, it's not a precisely even geometric shape. So some of those, they'd all work, it wouldn't be too big a problem, but they wouldn't work as well. Likewise, there is a front and a back here. If I turn this around the other way, you see how this corner here is a little bit off and this corner here is off. So just double check to make sure you're lining it up the way it's supposed to be. So yeah, that's basically lined up. I'm going to take some pins and I'm going to pin around it. I'm going to put in one pin here, just going up like this, to show where I'm going to start sewing. And then I'm going to just kind of loosely pin the rest together. This isn't, if you're really good at sewing, you probably don't need to do this, but if you're really good at sewing, you probably don't need this tutorial either, because this is pretty simple, but it's just easier to keep it together. I'm also going to put in another little parallel pin here, and this is going to mark where I stop sewing. Basically, I want these to look a little different from the other pins, because I want to remind myself when I get here that I need to stop, so I don't sew all the way around, and then I can't turn it inside out and fill it with stuffing. So yeah, I'm just going to leave myself like an inch and a half, and that should be enough to pull this open and put some stuffing in there when I'm done. So the last thing I'm going to need is my needle. I'm going to pull out just a manageable amount of thread. And just for security, I'm not going to thread this on camera. Okay, there we go. Yeah, just for security, to make this a little sturdier, I'm going to be using 2 lengths of thread, so this is just going through the middle. Sorry, this is probably kind of hard to see on camera. I'm going to pull this even at the other end. I'm going to take these two pieces and I'm going to tie them in a knot. There are probably better YouTube videos out there just showing the basics of sewing. This is a beginner project, so I am trying to include kind of all the little steps here. But if anything's confusing or if you feel like you need more help, then definitely look around. There's probably people with better camera setups than me who can show you how to do this again. So yeah, I've just tied a few little knots on top of each other, and that's going to help me secure the thread. And now we can get started. So this here's my starting point, and you can see here there's a good bit of white space at the end, just at the edge of the pattern, and I want to be sewing basically right in the middle of that. That's going to leave just a little bit of white space on the plushie itself to frame it, but it's also going to give me kind of a lot of error room, so if I end up kind of making a bit of a wobbly line, it won't really matter too much. So you can kind of see, even when these two are pressed together, you can see through to the dice layer below. I'm just going to try and go right in the middle there. And because I tied that triple knot at the end, this is sticking nicely, but I'm going to do just another little tiny stitch right on top, just to make sure that's secure. Now, I'm going to be sewing this with something called running stitch, which is very simple. It's probably what you think of when you think of sewing. You're just taking the needle up through the fabric, and then just very close by, you're putting it right back in. And you're trying to pull just hard enough so that the stitches stay flat against the fabric, but not so tight that things start bunching together like that. So right back up, and right back in. And I'm going around a curve here, but just keep looking at where your fabric is, where your print is underneath, and just try and stay right between the lines. But again, because we've got all that white space, and especially because it's kind of a soft, like fuzzy plushie, you can get away with being pretty messy about this. I'm also doing my best to keep my stitches quite small. It'll go faster, obviously, if you're using bigger stitches, but it's going to look a lot messier in the end, and you could have like little bits of stuffing kind of poking through, and it just won't be as strong. So small little stitches, pulling them through, but not pulling them so tight that you bunch up the fabric, is basically the way to go. This is going to get really boring if you want to watch the entire thing, so I'm just going to go ahead and do a little bit more stitching off camera, so it'll speed up this video for you. Okay, there's one other little trick I want to show you just as I'm going along. If you find you're having troubles where you keep pulling a bit too hard and bunching things up, and it's hard to keep things flat, one thing you can do is flatten your work out as best you can, flatten all your stitches, and then you can just go in and do a little back stitch. So I'm just going to sew, wrong way, I'm just going to sew right back to where I came from, and then back up near where I'm working. So you can kind of see I went back over a stitch, and that's just going to secure it, so it's going to be a lot harder for me to pull on all that work I've already done, and it'll help keep my work just a little bit smoother as I keep going. Okay, so now as you can see, I'm really only about halfway done, but I'm almost out of thread. I'm not going to have enough left to finish. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this thread. I'm just going to do that by doing a little back stitch, and then I'm just going to do a few little stitches as neatly as I can, all right on top of each other. So just back up and back down. And that's going to help secure my thread. So now once I've done those little stitches, I can put it back up to the top. I can snip that off, and that thread is finished. This won't come undone, and I'm just going to start off just like I did at the beginning right here. One thing you will notice is my two pieces of fabric are drifting a little bit. That's pretty normal, especially because I'm sewing a stretchy fabric to one that's pretty stiff. Probably if you're a better seamstress, you can make it do that less, but I'm only kind of okay at sewing. That's pretty normal. Once we get around to the end, we're going to do just a little bit of trimming and fix that up. But if you do find it's drifting too much, just try and ease things back together to make sure that you at least don't like run off the edge or have them completely sideways. Okay, so I actually made a little bit of a mistake when I switched my thread, and that I actually started up again back where I'd started instead of where I'd left off. So I'm not actually right back to the beginning, but the important part is that I've only got about an inch and a half left to sew, and that last little bit is along a straight edge. That's going to make it the easiest. So first what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do 3 neat little stitches on top of each other here to secure my thread. 1, 2, and 3. Now, there's a few things I could do here. If you're doing this yourself and you've been working in a colored thread around the edge to make it easier to see, this would be a great time to switch to a white thread because this last little bit is going to be a bit more visible. I'm not going to switch just because it's going to make it easier for you guys to see if I don't, and hopefully I can keep it neat so that it won't be too much of a problem. So I'm just actually not going to cut this off. I'm just going to kind of leave it there while I do some trimming, and I'll get back to it in a minute. Yeah, so now I'm just going to do a bit of trimming. I'll cut off this little marker piece here, and as you can see, my backing was a little bit larger than my front piece anyways, and it's kind of slid across, so I'm just going to trim it down a little bit, making sure to still leave a good centimeter, 1/4 inch between my stitch marks and the edge of the fabric. And that's going to stop things from coming undone in case there's a little bit of fraying. If you wanted to, you could trim it just a little bit closer, but again, if you go too close, then you risk everything coming apart. Yeah, so now that that's trimmed, I'm going to turn this inside out. And I'm going to be very careful of this needle because I'm keeping it in. Again, if you want this to be easier, just cut off that and you can start a new thread on the inside. And there, I'm just going to poke. This plushie is small enough it's easy to just poke at the corners with your fingers. If you really want them sharper, sometimes it's nice to use a pencil to really get in there, but because these aren't really very sharp corners, just the finger is usually fine. Yeah, there we go. It's basically done. And the last step is going to be stuffing. So it's easier, you're going to get a neater stuffing filling. Actually, first what I'm going to do is, you see how I've got this thread here? I'm just going to make one little stitch to bring my needle to the front of the fabric. That way I won't accidentally bury it in stuffing. Okay, so stuffing. You're going to get a neater stuffing filling if you're using little balls of it. and just really pushing it to the bottom, as opposed to just trying to take a huge clump and just shove the whole thing in. This will let you really fill out the shape and make sure you're really getting it into those corners. I like to use a lot of stuffing. You can basically stuff this as much or as little as you want, but no matter how much you want to put in there, it's probably going to take about 2 or 3 times as much as you think it's going to take, because that's just how it happens. One tip, if you're having trouble finding bags of stuffing, or if it's just really expensive, because it tends to be very expensive to get them here, I usually actually just go to IKEA, and they have like $2 bed pillows. They're not very good as pillows, but they're filled with polyester stuffing, basically exactly the same thing you'd pay $7.99 for to get in a bag from a craft store. So I tend to just buy those and take them apart. This is actually real craft stuffing, I just happen to have a bag around, but just using pillows, or you can go to a thrift store and see if you can find a nice, not too used pillow there, and sometimes, depending on where you are, that's actually an easier way to get your stuffing. Yeah, okay, I'm pretty happy with that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that these are tucked in. There's just about as much white stuff showing as usual, so that that is even with all the other edges. I'm just going to put a pin in there for now, and go back to my thread. So if you were starting a new thread here, you'd want to just tie it in a knot as usual, but kind of dig it in and come up from the inside, so you're hiding the knot on the inside. But I've just got my old thread, so I'm just going to keep going from here. Try and refocus for you. Okay, so I'm going to be doing something called a ladder stitch here. And basically what this is so I'm starting on the fuzzy side right now. That's where my thread is. So I'm going to go into the non-fuzzy side. I'm just going to make a little stitch just along the seam. Pull that through. And then I'm going to go to the fuzzy side and do the same thing. I'm going to make a little stitch and pull it through. And then back to the other side. So you're making this kind of little ladder of stitches that goes along. Again, I'm not really set up here to explain this super well. So if you're confused about exactly how this works, I watched people doing this stitch like 3 or 4 times before I understood what the heck was happening. I just went onto Google and Googled for ladder stitch, and I found some diagrams that were really helpful. Or you might find other YouTubers, or if you're really lucky and you have someone around you who knows how to sew, you can get them to show you in person. So this is where it really pays to be as neat as possible, because if you do it very neatly, if you do it very neatly, you can see here the stitches barely show up at all. They're basically just hidden between the 2 layers of fabric. But if you're a little less careful, then this is where your thread's going to show the most. If you find by the time you get close to the end that you'd actually like it to be a little bit more filled with stuffing, I sometimes squeeze just a little bit in while I've got just a tiny bit of extra space, but I think I'm going to be happy enough with this when it's puffed out. So once you're at the end, it's probably a more official way to end this, but I like to just sort of hook in, see if I can catch catch one of the other little stitches and just catch another stitch and make a little knot. And sometimes I'll do that 2 or 3 times if I'm not sure I got it. So I'm just going to catch that stitch and make a little knot. And then once I've got that secured, I'm going to push my pin down way into the plushie and pull it out the other side, and then pull that taut and very carefully trim it right next to the fabric. And now the end of that piece of thread is just going to be hidden inside. And that's basically that. This is the finished plushie. This is my first time I've made one up with this fabric, so I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. This is going to be kind of cool. It's like a little mini cushion. Yeah, I really hope you enjoyed watching this. If you do have any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comments below. And yeah, if you want to see more of my stuff, mostly drawing stuff, then please feel free to check out the rest of my channel, my other videos. And if you enjoyed this one, please consider subscribing for more. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you in my next video.